Hello and welcome to the State of the Fleet Industry, a weekly video series produced by Automotive Fleet magazine and which is sponsored by Enterprise Fleet Management. I'm Mike Antich, editor of Automotive Fleet, and today I'd like to examine what's occurring in the fleet industry for the week of December 28, 2020. And as we're only 4 days away from the start of a new year, I'd like to focus today's presentation on what occurred in the 2020 calendar year and the key milestones that have brought us up to this point in time. And I'd like to conclude the presentation by examining some of the key trends that we're going to be following as we start going into the first quarter of 2021. So when you look back on the 2020 year, the first 2 months, January, February, were very strong, had all indications that this was going to be a strong commercial fleet year, but all of that stuff changed, at least here in the U.S., on March 1 when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared a national emergency. And at that point, things went downhill very dramatically. From the period of March 15th to the end of March, all assembly plants in North America, Mexico, US, Canada, all of them one by one started to cease production. All of the physical auctions at that time closed. The only way you could remarket a vehicle in that time frame was selling it online. And the economy was divided into essential, non-essential businesses, and those fleets that were part of non-essential businesses, they were pretty much idle during this period, unable to operate. There were widespread layoffs, furloughs, and all companies transitioned to moving their employees to work from home, to work remotely. And as we got into April, things went from bad to worse. In fact, the month of April represented the largest monthly decline in resale values in the history of the fleet industry. And with the factories closed, deliveries were non-existent, and those vehicles that were ordered prior to the factory shutdown, they were trapped someplace in that order to delivery pipeline. Dealers, for the most part, were closed. Maintenance facilities might have been open, but on the sales side, they were closed. Courtesy deliveries were very problematic if they're going to be occurring. And plus, on top of that, many drivers, fleet drivers, were reluctant to go to the dealership to pick up their new vehicles out of fear of contagion. And even if you're lucky enough to get a new vehicle, licensing and titling this vehicle was very problematic since all of the DMVs were either closed or only operating on an appointment-only basis. But despite this downward roller coaster that we're on, things towards the end of April were starting to improve. What was happening was the inventory in the wholesale market was becoming so small that demand was actually exceeding supply, which was causing resale values to start to increase. And towards the end of April, we were starting to see conversion rates. That's the percentage of vehicles that were consigned to auction that were actually sold increased to that 50 percentile range, which even in a normal good year, that's a strong number. So in a pandemic year with resale values or conversion rates going up to 50%, that was a very positive indicator. And things again started to improve in May. We had a record jobs report, which was totally unexpected and ran contrary to forecasts. The factories were starting to reopen, with some of the early companies being Mercedes, Toyota, Hyundai, Kia, VW, all of them indicated they were going to be opening production. And then, all of the big domestic OEMs were open by the end of May. There were emergences of new safety protocols, which were kind of unprecedented in our industry and most likely are going to be adopted as standard practices, at least through the coming years. But by May 28th, there were 28 assembly plants had reopened. But in this roller coaster up and down situation, although we had all those positive signs there, then on May 22nd, Hertz declares Chapter 11. And 7 days later, Advantage Rent-A-Car likewise declares Chapter 11. And all during this time, rental car demand had literally collapsed. Rental car purchases had collapsed. But nonetheless, there were the positive signs. Fuel prices still remained low. The government had passed its first stimulus bill, and these stimulus monies were starting to work their way through the economy, which was benefiting the fleet industry because a lot of those stimulus checks were being used as down payments for used vehicle purchases. And one of the key reasons for the increase in demand for used vehicles is many people that were previously reliant upon public transportation were shying away from it out of concerns for contagion. So all of that was increasing that demand for used vehicles, and with stimulus check in hand, there's your down payment to acquire one. So retail sales for automotive were rebounding. Resale values, as I've mentioned, were rebounding. Truck demand was extremely strong on both the retail and fleet side of the business. But in this roller coaster world that we were living in at the time, on the flip side, all of our industry conferences were either being rescheduled or canceled altogether. And sales were still down. At the end of May, commercial fleet sales compared to same time last year were down 60%. Rental sales were down 91%. Totally unprecedented. But we're on this roller coaster. Come July, we're still experiencing these record job creation numbers. Months of May, June, and July were the top 3 months in the history of the country, and they all were happening sequentially. So there was a positive indicator there. Retail auto sales, again, were very strong. It proved that there was a large pent-up demand for vehicles in the marketplace. And auction conversion rates, which I mentioned earlier, were at the 50 percentile range. As we got into the summer months, they were hitting 70 to 80% conversion rates. So this was extremely strong demand for these vehicles from dealers because they knew they had the customers to buy those vehicles. But the underlying issue, the drag on the economy, despite all of that good news, was the uncertainty. And this was probably best exemplified by looking at the Standard & Poor's, the S&P index, which the majority of the companies in that index were no longer giving forward guidance. They weren't able to predict what their business was going to be like in the next quarter or two. And because the reason for that was they didn't know. There was this uncertainty because of the pandemic. There were pressures at that time to start reopening the economy, and we saw states reopening in the southeast, southwest parts of the country, but then there was that corresponding resurgence of COVID infections, which again created that uncertainty as to what was going to be going on. But used car sales remained strong, but at the same time, companies were delaying their fleet replacements. The other thing that was happening with this decrease in business activity is operating costs were totally reduced and flat. It was primarily induced by the pandemic in less miles being driven. The other big positive aspect of the pandemic was this unbelievable growth in last mile delivery. And as we enter the peak season, which we're currently in, for that time from Thanksgiving till the first week in January, this has all the indications that it's going to be the largest peak season in the history of e-commerce and last mile delivery. And one of the things that we'll look towards as we go into 2021 is that percentage of business growth that'll be occurring in that market compared to same time last year. We had a lot of uncertainty due to the elections. It's still continuing in many ways. There are questions in terms of future taxation, whether there's going to be a reinstitution of regulations which in the past 4 years had been relaxed, questions about the clean air agenda, but last mile delivery remains strong. There's long lead times for vans. These vans are being acquired by all of these companies that they can get a hold of to operate their businesses. They're having trouble keeping up with the demand that's coming out of e-commerce. So what are the predictions? The predictions as we start looking forward to 2021 is, when we've talked about this a lot, our hope and anticipation is that fleet spring vehicle sales are going to be increasing. And so we'll be watching that very closely as we start getting the sales reports. The other thing is, when are in-person conferences going to be starting? Are they going to be starting in June as the vaccines are fully rolled out? We're seeing a lot of electric vehicles, EV product in the marketplace, and we're going to see more to come. We're only seeing the tip of the spear in regards to that. And the other big question that we're going to be following is, when are companies going to be allowing in-person sales meetings? Or are these virtual meetings the new norm that's going to be appearing in this industry? So these are all trends that we'll be examining as we get into 2021. So with that, I'd like to conclude my State of the Industry presentation for the week of December 28th. I'd like to wish everyone a great new year and all the best, and I'd like to thank you for listening.